Alrighty, folks, it's May of 2024, and after over a year and a half of grinding and effort and analysis and feedback and work, late nights, early mornings, putting in the time, putting in the effort, it finally happened. I finally broke 90 in a round of golf. Jason, you were there. You saw it with your own eyes. I have a witness. I officially broke 90 in golf.
I cannot believe that you are going to take this episode about NIST 800-171's final draft and turn it into yourself and your breaking 90. What I
Yeah,
will say is I did witness the round. It was magical. Pace and tempo were the key. And I don't know how you did it in under a year, but yes, tireless determination, relentless effort, and we'll say a stroke of luck, a few members' bounces, as we like to
100%.
call it.
100%. I got a good member bounce here and there. Oh, yeah. And by the way, 800, 171 revision 3 and 171 revision 171A revision 3 have been published. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what's going on in those documents, because much like my golf game, it has been a struggle for the last 12 to 18 months to finally get to this point. So let's look at the scorecard and see let's see how things shook out, shall we? So obviously, anytime we're going to dissect something like 171 and 171A, there's a million rabbit holes that we could go down. We'll have independent episodes talking about a lot of the details that go into what make up 171 Rev 3 and 171A Rev 3. This episode is really just going to cover seven high level things that people need to know
Seven things,
about the
seven.
documents. And then we'll go with that. And it should be a good starting point for people to reference in the maybe 2 years from now, when people are actually required to implement this version of the standard, which we're going to talk about.
It's oddly strange how we always go into these documents and we're like, let's just pull out a certain amount of things that will be beneficial to people, and it always ends up being seven things. I don't know.
It's never six, and it's never eight. It's always seven.
Well, one time it was eight, but that was we threw bonus stuff in there, like a extra mile. But seven things to know about 800-171 revision 3.
For sure. All right, well, let's jump right into it, because these could be rabbit holes in and of themselves. So first things first, the first thing to know, revision 3 is an increase compared to revision 2, but the formatting changes in 800-171 revision 3 kind of make that difficult to understand, because, as people probably know, 800-171 revision 2 has 110 security requirements in it. 800-171 revision 3 has 97 security requirements in it. That's a 12% decrease, everybody. Our requirements have gone down. The standard is smaller, right?
Well, so yeah, the standard is smaller as far as quantifiable, the number of controls that must be implemented, the number of requirements that are there, right, Jacob? But wasn't the goal of the revision of 800-171 R2 to R3 to eliminate redundancy? And by way eliminating the redundancy, what we saw was basically controls being withdrawn, but not necessarily disappearing, right?
Yeah. So in the miracle of withdrawn controls in the world of NIST, and this is not unique to 171. This happens in 853. This has happened in 853 for 20 years, right? Withdrawn does not mean that the control has gone away. It does not mean that the control has been eliminated. Actually, in the 20 years that 853 has been around, very, very few times has the language of a security control actually been removed from the catalog. Typically, what happens is that language is incorporated into other controls or somehow combined with other controls. What they mean by withdrawn is that the control identifier is withdrawn from use, but it still stays there so that they don't reuse identifiers. Sound familiar, everybody? So if AC17 is incorporated into AC18, they say that AC17 is withdrawn. If you go read AC18, you'll find all that text that was withdrawn in the text of AC18. So we have gone down in the number of requirements, but as you'll see, if you sort of dig under the hood, most of the requirements that are withdrawn are just put elsewhere in the document, so they don't really go away. So, like we talked about, withdrawn controls aren't really withdrawn And unless you look at 800 171A, this like shell game of saying there's 110 requirements, there's 97 requirements is it's not a good approach in my opinion. I think it's a mistake for them to do that. For instance, 171 Rev 2 represents 126 controls from 853 that are determined to be relevant to protecting the confidentiality of CUI, but they show up in 171 as 110 things. This version of 853 Rev 5 says there's 156 controls that are relevant to protecting CUI, but they show up in 171 Rev 3 as 97 things. So it's completely arbitrary how they combine and withdraw and merge and shift the formatting of the controls. So you will not get an accurate picture of what's actually involved with this standard compared to the previous standard just by looking at 171. You have to look at 171A.
But then if you have looked at 171 Rev 2 and then you look at Rev 3 where the withdrawns have been incorporated into other controls, realistically what you see is things that make a lot more sense and things that go together. And we talked about the elimination of redundancy, but a lot of times when you read 171, it would say, do this thing for this certain situation, right? And then you would go to another control, and that control would say, do this same exact thing we asked you to do two controls ago, but for a completely different thing. And now when you read Rev 3, you see both of those related things all combined into one specific control.
Yeah,
and that's where
this is probably another rabbit hole that we can go down on a specific episode. I don't agree with them merging controls. So let's give everybody an example. So if you want to follow along at home, in 171 Rev 2, requirement 3.2.3 is provide security awareness training on insider threats. In 171 Rev 3, the requirement 3.2.3 is withdrawn, incorporated into 3.2.1. And now if you go look at 3.2.1 in revision 3, it has 5 items by it instead of just one line like it does in Rev 2. One of those 5 items says insider threat training, right? So
for me, I think that's better though.
Well, the problem that I have with that is that in the 853 catalog, they have base controls and they have control enhancements. Sure. And so you have a base control, security awareness training, and then you enhance that control with various other enhancements. This is something we talked about at CS2 Live, or at Summit Up Live at CS2 Denver. Personally, I think it is better to maintain the base control enhancement structure because it gives you a rough sequence of saying, implement the base control, then do the control enhancement. And typically when people look at 171, they struggle to identify where do I start? And so even though NIST is never going to indicate start here, then do this, and then afterwards do that, they can use the existing structure of the 853 catalog, which is represented roughly in 171, to sort of gyrate and move their hands around and generally indicate start here and then do this. Sure. I think that would be very helpful. I think that it helps with referencing back to the catalog for more information. I don't agree with them merging these controls because it does things like make some controls 5 items or 20 items long rather than keeping them all about the same size. But that's something that we can talk about later on in the future.
This is probably one of the very few times in history that we disagree on something, but it is what it is.
Well, I see the case for it. I don't personally agree with it. I mean, if people like it,
so for writing to us, people that fully understand it, yes, I actually would jump on your side. But when you're trying to write and make it ingestible for people that don't necessarily read this quite as much as we do, I can see where, yes, yes, it works completely, and that's why I jump on board with it. I agree.
Well, obviously that design decision has reigned supreme, and it will be that way for years now until they revise 171 again. So I'll just yell at the clouds until the next public comment period, and then we can talk about it again. Just for everyone's reference, there are 33 withdrawn controls in 171 Rev 3. And if you read the corresponding frequently asked questions documents that's posted with 171 Rev 3, they have a question listed in there. Why were selected security requirements incorporated into other requirements, resulting in multi-part requirements? And they basically say security requirements are often closely related. For efficiency and increased understanding, certain requirements have been withdrawn and incorporated into other requirements. This, quote, does not add to the total number of requirements. I think that they are spinning too many plates. and that if they didn't do that formatting and combining and withdrawing and incorporating in 853, they shouldn't then go off and do it in 171. But the standard is now official, so that's the formatting that they went with. Check out the FAQ for more information. Okay, so the second point here, SP 800-171A revision 3 has increased significantly. Remember, we went from 110 requirements to 97, so it's supposed to go down, right? Wrong. Actually, instead of 320 determination statements that you currently have that correspond to 171 revision 2, you now have 422 determination statements in 171A revision 3. That is a 32% increase over the current set of requirements. That does not include the organizationally defined parameters that are included in this standard, which we're going to talk about in a moment. One thing that they have improved on in 171 Rev 3 is that 171A is now mentioned multiple times throughout the document. What a concept, right? Including on page 5, which we'll put up on the screen, a distinct call-out box that says, please, for the love of God, you have to read 171A in order to understand what you need to do to implement these requirements. Good job, NIST. You probably should have put that call out box on every single page, but we'll take what we can get. I'm glad that they put it at the front. Now there is at least a little bit more of a connection between the two documents. I still don't understand why 171 and 171A are not a single document. Yet another one of my comments that was discarded this time around. Maybe in the future they will seek to combine them, but they are still separate documents. For reference, there were 389 non-ODP verification steps in the final draft of SP 800-171 revision 3. So we actually went up from the final draft rather than down. And if you have learned anything from this podcast since we've been doing it, 171A is the center of gravity for knowing if the controls are implemented, both for your team internally and for external assessment teams under programs like CMMC. So do not only read 171 Rev 3, you must orient around 171A Rev 3.
From my initial first pass in reading 171A and noticing the 10% increase to the determination statements that need to be achieved, the boxes that need to be checked, however you want to refer to them, I think it's great. I think that what it is it's very granular and it gets down to the details of the things that organizations need to implement to make sure that a control has been successfully and fully implemented, right? I think that there's one outlying factor, and there's a little game that I played, kind of like, you know those prediction shows where, you know, the analysts go on there and they're like, all right, the Washington Commanders, we're going to predict their 2024 record based off of their schedule, right?
What is that prediction, Jason?
It's not very good. I'd say 10 wins would be a miracle.
10 wins for the Commanders. Woof.
But what I wanted to do was like kind of play like just with my experience and like going through different types of assessments and seeing some of the ODPs that are being offered up there aside from the determination statements, trying to guess like what they would be like. What do you think they're going to? What's the session lockout timer going to be? I bet it's 15 minutes. You know what I mean? Like things like that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that was an interesting game to play. But as I read through all the determination statements, really, Jacob, what I noticed is that the list of instructions needed to understand if you've implemented a control correctly has become more detailed, more in depth, and more, I guess, applicable to the actual control itself.
Yeah,
it's not open-ended statements, right? It's not.
It's definitely better. I think that the advantage of them formatting 171 closer to the format of 853 is that the jump between 171 and 171A is not now so shocking to people, because you go from a single nebulous statement to multiple verification steps that correspond to it. When you have a multi-part 853 control, even if it's partially represented in 171, and then you have a multiple step verification process that corresponds to it in 171A, it makes more sense that there are multiple steps for multiple things rather than multiple steps for a single thing in revision 2. So I think that formatting is an improvement. Now, it's a debate. We've talked about this in the past. Some people, call ODPs determination statements and they include them all together. For our purposes here, when we refer to that 422, we're just talking about the determination statements themselves. If you look at the formatting of 171 Rev 3, it just goes ODPs at the top straight into determination statements. the same way that 853A is formatted now, although slightly not quite as clean. But that's the standard that you need to orient yourself to. Let's talk about ODPs, shall we?
Okay.
So this has been the hot button issue, right? This has been the one that really sent people into a tizzy over the last year and a half. And good news, everybody. Bad news, ODPs are 100% here to stay. There are
Absolutely.
88 organizationally defined parameters in NIST SP 800-171 Revision 3. For reference, the final draft of Rev 3 had 95 ODPs. For reference even further, if you squint really hard, there are 110 things in 800-171 Revision 2, if you read 171A, that require you to either define or specify a value. What would we call those? Those are organizationally defined parameters. Those are variables that need to be specified. Now, they are not labeled as ODPs, but they are variables that need to be defined. And if you look at the corresponding control in 853, then you'll see they come from the ODP in the control from which it is derived in 800-171.
I think the biggest standout that I've noticed, or the biggest, or the easiest way for me to explain it, is that in Rev 2, the ODPs that existed were at the discretion of actually the organization required to implement the control to define, right? And now the ODPs that are in Rev 3 are at the discretion of the organization that chooses to adopt the guidance document in order to apply it there.
Yeah, I've got a bone to pick. I've got a bone to pick with Ron over this situation. This is definitely a huge.
Well, there was a lot of situations where people had to define timeout frequencies, like we just mentioned, on the last topic and things like that, and they were like, "I don't know what a good what's the industry best standard, or what's the best one." And so now they're like, "I need you to tell me, NIST." And now NIST is saying, we're not necessarily going to tell you, but we're going to make it so somebody's going to have to tell you. Right?
Yeah, no, that is a good point. By making the ODP field explicit, it does force the issue of defining the ODPs. Although it has always been true forever and ever.
Uniform structure to requirements across the board is what it turns into.
Yeah, and that NIST is never going to be the one that defines those ODPs. So there's two things here. One, I predict that DoD is 100% going to issue an official list of values that correspond to these ODP variables, and they're going to make that the guidance. That's a good thing because it gives people more clarity. That's also Absolutely. A bad thing because if you're a contractor that handles CUI from the DoD and any other agency, and any of those other agencies disagree about what those minimum ODP values need to be, you've got a problem on your hands because you've got different guidance for protecting the same baseline of data on a single system. This, back in the day, no one remembers this, but back in the day, this was exactly the problem that NARA was appointed to deal with as the CUI executive agent. They were supposed to get all the agencies on the same page. It seems clear to me at this point that ship has sailed. No one is pressing NARA to get back in charge of this program. And so for those companies that only do work for the DoD, it's really not that big of an issue. But it's just something that we're going to have to watch sort of in the back of our minds here, where as the FAR CUI rule comes up, as other agencies start to use 171, as ODPs get defined in various different environments, there could be a discrepancy issue that could cause a problem, which, was supposed to be addressed 10 years ago, but that's sort of besides the point. That's basically just a footnote now.
So hopefully what I'm about to say doesn't cause people to throw pitchforks and torches and highly judge me and ostracize me for my point of view here. So let's just breathe deep and see how this goes. In my mind, the point that you made about it may cause conflicting problems for organizations that have CUI requirements from the DoD, and the DoD sets boundaries, and then those ODPs are then set by other agencies which are requiring them to implement requirements, and they set ODPs that are different values. Mm-hmm. The naive thinking in me thinks that, well, we have this example right here that's being put into place, and DoD has, once again, I don't want to say led by example, but has been on the forefront of developing the CUI protection program, and et cetera, based off of the FAR CUI rule taking too long and coming with DFARS rules, and et cetera, right? what if there's like some sort of, I don't know, national strategy where one of the major outcomes of that national strategy that all these people are putting these plans together saying this is how we're going to carry it out is to unify cybersecurity requirements across all government agencies? Wouldn't that include
Listen,
organizationally defined parameters and
the original
specifications?
before harmonization was cool, right? The CUI program was the original harmonization effort. And
Sure.
so now what we've done is we're allowing DoD to define the ODPs, which is fine, but we're also allowing other agencies to define ODPs, which theoretically is fine. And as we know, agencies like CISA and agencies like DoD don't always get along. And so if you end up with two different sets of requirements, we end up in a CERC-CIA type of an issue where you've got one set of reporting requirements for one thing, you've got another set of reporting requirements for another thing. Defining the ODPs at a high level government wide should be, as to your point, under the banner of harmonization. Now,
But
like
no,
I
there
said,
should be like the homeowners association thing, right? Where you can't build a shed on your land right now because the bylaws say that you've got to do
have you
this
seen
this.
the story? Have you seen the story of the guy who got told that he can't store his boat in his driveway? He has to build a fence, so he
Yeah,
painted a
is it my
picture of his
neighbor? Because that happens. Every
well, he
month my
painted a
neighbor goes through
picture
the
of his
same thing.
boat
Yeah,
on the fence that is hiding his boat in like
I
the.
did see that. That's
It's the best.
genius.
It's the
But what
best.
I'm saying is that like if I'm DoD, right, and I set my ODPs, and then let's say the Department of Commerce comes out with the same similar requirements, right, and their ODPs are all off the wall and nowhere near unified or even close to what we have going on. Don't I have permission to hold up the national security strategy or even the intent of the Department of Commerce to carry out that national security strategy and say, hey, you are going according to plan here, right? At
No,
some
you
point, somebody
don't.
has to
You
step up
don't.
and say,
You as DoD don't get to tell Commerce what to do. This is a policy debate. This is one of the rabbit holes that we can probably address in the future. For most people listening to this podcast, this will be an edge case. So let's just sort of wrap up this section
sure,
with this.
absolutely.
Technically, you are already defining ODPs by complying with 800.171 Rev 2. You've done it 110 times if you have fully implemented Rev 2. Rev 3 just makes what you're doing more explicit in the formatting, and technically, by only having 88 ODPs, it has decreased what you need to do by 20%. I think that DoD is going to issue guidance on what they want those values to be in the future, which is something that we're going to have to monitor. But they're here to stay. Don't be alarmed if you are already implementing and complying with 171A. You're already doing this. It is not as big of an issue as the LinkedIn hive mind might lead you to believe. And there you go. We can talk about the policy discrepancies of ODPs maybe at a future date. Okay, moving on. Number 4, new control families. New control families. Okay, so from the frequently asked questions, 3 new security requirement families have been added to Revision 3 to maintain consistency with the SP 853 Bravo moderate baseline. They are Planning, PL, System and Service Acquisition, SA, and Supply Chain Risk Management, SR. Newsflash for everybody, 2 of those 3 are not new at all because they already existed in 800.171. They just didn't exist explicitly, just like ODPs. We're really just updating the formatting to sort of pull the veil back on what was actually going on under the hood. So the best example of this is from the planning family. SSPs are a planning family control. The control PL2 says have an SSP. You have had a requirement to have an SSP in 800.171, so you've already been doing controls from the planning family.
Raise hand.
Yes,
Sorry.
question, yes.
Yeah, I mean, but technically, haven't you had all of these requirements already anyway?
Well,
For
here's
Rev
an
2?
example. So here's an example from the planning family. The only new controls would be policies and procedures and rules of behavior. Now, policies and procedures are currently in Rev 2 and NFO control, which we're going to
That's
talk
what I'm
about
saying. Yeah,
in a little
like
bit. So really the only new thing under planning is rules of behavior, which is already kind of in Rev 2. So it's new in the sense that it looks new. It's formatted in a way that is made explicit and thus new, but it isn't really asking you to do new stuff, net new tasks. And that's really the story. We're going to need more time to do the detailed line by line analysis for a future episode. But in this 32% increase of 171A Rev 3 over the existing 171A, really it's just more questions about the things you're already doing rather than net new things that you haven't been doing whatsoever. So an example of this in the SA family, SA9 external system services and NFO control. Now it is an explicit requirement. Is it new? Maybe. But then you have something like SA22, unsupported system components. This shows up as requirement 3.16.2, whereas in 800.171 Rev 2, the requirement 3.13.2 was already there, and that's the control SA8. So it's new, but you've already been doing a lot of the things that are in those families. The only net new family, actually 100% bona fide new thing, is the supply chain risk management family, SR, which is new because it didn't exist in 853 Rev 4. It was added in 853 Rev 5. So everything in the SR family did not exist in 800.171 Rev 2 at all. So in that sense, there are new requirements that are net new things that you have not done before. So if you want to take a closer look at that, you should look at requirements 3.17.1, 2, and 3, as well as requirement 3.11.1 in 800.171 Rev 3. These aren't extremely technical requirements. These are mostly having a plan, supplier reviews, things like that. Mostly your supply chain risk management. It isn't actually like a technical thing that you're going to have to go out and buy a blinky light box and plug in and have somebody administer for you. But definitely check that out, because they added that to 853, which is a big deal, which means it's going to show up in derivative standards like 171. So it's going to be a point of emphasis for them this season, if you will.
I like the additions and the eliminations of assumptions, right? So I think that's essentially what we see here is the additions of things that were overdue and long needed in supply chain risk management, and the elimination of assumptions when it comes to some of the planning mechanisms, some of the GRC elements that are needed within a cybersecurity program for them to move forward. So I open arms welcome not only this, but then the next topic, which is the elimination of NFO controls.
Yeah. And just as a note on the new things, it's like ODPs are new, right? Just to everybody take everything that you read about 171 Rev 3 with a grain of salt, because the things that are new are not as new as they are sometimes made out to be. The increases in the amount of things you have to do, not exactly net new increases. So now, thanks to the class deviation, which we're also going to talk about, you have a lot of time to do more of the same things you've already been doing. So, everybody's got time to take a breath here. But yes, to your point, number 5 here, no more NFO controls. Hooray! Air horns. Producer Dustin, cue up the air horns. Air horns for everybody. No more NFO controls. The worst blemish on the tailoring decisions of 853 moderate baseline down to 171 was the freaking NFO controls. So for those of you who don't know, controls that were, quote, expected to be routinely satisfied by non-federal organizations without specification were assigned the code NFO in 800.171. This essentially was NIST assuming what non-federal organizations would already be doing, and therefore they felt they did not need to specify the requirement to do that thing. And as we have talked about with Ron on the many hours of podcast conversations we've had with him at this point, this was a colossal mistake. This was a bad assumption. This was not true. If you do not explicitly require organizations to do a thing, then there is no guarantee that they will do a thing. In the DIB specifically and in other critical infrastructure sectors, it is not a safe assumption to assume that companies already have an existing, well-managed, risk-informed, robust information security program that you can build off of with your standard. If you want them to do a thing, you have to specify that they need to do the thing. There were more than 60 of these assumptions in 800.171 Rev 2 and before. The big ones that come to mind are policies and procedures, the -1 controls for every 853 family. Those are now required. And my personal favorite, personally, I think one of the most important controls in the entire baseline, SA9, external system services, the requirements that you impose on your managed service providers and the way that you have verified that they have implemented the requirements that you have imposed on them contractually via your SLAs whatever those happen to be. With 171 Rev 3, anything that was an NFO control is now tailored as directly related to CUI with the tag CUI, not directly related and therefore not required with the tag NCO, or the domain of only federal organizations with the tag FED, FED. Massive improvement. But like we've talked about in the past, when you eliminate those assumptions, those controls have to go somewhere, and they can't tailor all of them out as being completely unrelated. And thus we see an increase in the number of things that you have to answer for in the revision 3 standard.
How many ill-informed decisions do you think have been made based off the fact that assumptions weren't appropriately carried out? By that, I mean, I've had many conversations where trying to explain the need or necessity for something as foundational as policies and procedures was met with rejection because it did not carry a NIST 800-171 number on it. It's not required of me. I'm not required to do it. No, it's not required of you as a part of this implementation strategy.
And
but it is assumed because you already do it, right?
Yeah.
Because these are things that even my 4-year-old would do. You know, well, she's 6
now.
Well,
besides that, I mean, besides the fundamental nature of a lot of the controls that are marked as NFO, the problem, the trap that happens is during verification. If you don't care about any of this inherently, you just care because the DoD is going to come and verify you externally, then you need to care about the NFO controls. And for the next several years, this is going to continue to be a problem. And this is exactly how. Remember when we talked about how you're already defining ODPs? You're already defining and specifying values for these various requirements. Well, where are you doing that? Where are you documenting the definition and specification of these values? Where are you writing it down? You would specify and define and document all of this stuff in policy and procedure. And so when the verification steps in 171A seek to verify that you are doing these things that you have defined, what do you need in order to do the verification? You need the policies and procedures. But because the policies and procedures were assumed to exist and not specified as a requirement, people don't have them. So you show up to externally assess a organization, they can't show you where any of this stuff is written down, so you can't verify, you can't assess them. And the irony here is that under CMMC 1.0, back in the day, gather round, children, and let us tell you the tale of CMMC 1.0. Back in the day, CMMC 1.0 was famous because they had process maturity in combination with just the requirements. And all process maturity really was policies and procedures with a new name on top. In fact, if you go back and you look closely, they are exactly the same as the -1 controls from 853. When we went to CMMC 2.0 and we aligned to the NIST standards, we no longer required the process maturity policies and procedures. We just assumed that they would exist. And now here we are again with process maturity NFO controls going away. The irony being with this class deviation, it'll be a couple of years before we get back to where CMMC 1.0 actually wanted us to start friggin' 4.5 years ago.
Yeah, I remember the times during 1.0 explaining to people, you also have to have a plan, how you expect to fund this, how you expect to maintain these changes, how you expect to staff this, what services you're going to use to fulfill this, etc. And then it just all disappeared, and we just went archaic almost. Like, it's like
we're it's coming full circle around. Like, I don't know if you guys have how old your kids are if you're listening, but baggy pants are back, right? Dresses over jeans are back. Crew socks are back. We were talking about this in the fashion cycle has now completely gone back around on itself. And here we are right back into CMMC 1.0 land. Policy and procedure, process maturity is back on the menu. We have now tailored crew socks back into the baseline. Yes, apparently, ask your kids at home. If you wear ankle socks at the gym, it is an indicator that you are now an old person. So
how do your legs get tanned?
How fun. Yeah, I know. Like, crews, I'll never understand it. Anyways, moving on. It's a good thing that they got rid of NFOs. I'm very, very pleased with that. Item 6 here, getting close to the end. ORC controls are here to stay. It's touch and go around here. We got rid of NFOs, added a lot of clarity, reduced a lot of confusion, made huge strides, 2 steps forward, and here we go, in my opinion, one step backwards with ORC controls. So when, quote, the outcome of the control related to protecting confidentiality of CUI is adequately covered by other related controls, they are designated as ORC controls. There are 11 ORC controls in SP 800-171 Revision 3. For example, SR12, component disposal, is marked as ORC, and therefore it is not directly represented in 171 Revision 3 because, allegedly, it is adequately addressed by the control MP6, media sanitization. MP6 shows up in 171 Rev 3 as the requirement 3.8.3 media sanitization. The problem with this is, and this is something I have a real problem with because this is going to cause massive problems with CMMC assessments, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on the CAP and the training and the explanation of how CMMC rolls out, because nowhere in 853 or 853A does MP6 deal with component disposal. It doesn't say disposal. It doesn't reference disposal. It doesn't include verification steps for disposal. It refers to media sanitization prior to disposal. And so as a result, how does MP6 cover the items in SR12, let alone the verification steps for SR12 and 853? In my opinion, it is clear that they do not. Now, they are very closely related. And if we were going to make a compromise, I would say that you should merge those two. You should combine those two into a requirement that might say something like 3.8.3 media sanitization and disposal.
And destruction, or
destruction. And disposal, right?
Yeah.
We already do this merging of requirements elsewhere. And this is the reason why I think that it's going to cause problems for CMMC, because they have said that ORC controls are related to protecting the confidentiality of CUI. They're not tailored out of the baseline as an NCO control. They're not tailored out of the baseline as a Fed control. They have been determined to be related to protecting CUI confidentiality. But if you satisfy a different control, then it is going to cover this control. So as an assessor, when you see that people have implemented MP6 media sanitization, but they are not doing disposal or they are not doing it securely, what do? Do you just ignore it because the guidance says that you've done MP6, so we just don't worry about what the component disposal is doing? There's 11 examples of this in the standard where you have controls, 11 things that are related to protecting CUI confidentiality, but we're not going to verify them directly as long as other things that don't cover them, when you read very closely, are satisfied. I think this leaves the door open for a lot of wishy-washy nonsense during an assessment. I think it's going to require very specific guidance. I think it's just a little lazy on NIST's part. If they are related to CUI confidentiality, then they need to be represented in the standard in some way. If they're not related to CUI confidentiality, then they don't need to be represented in some way. And I just find it extremely unlikely that coming off the heels of an 853 Rev 5 revision, where they reduced and eliminated redundancy among the controls, that all of a sudden we found 11 spots in the moderate baseline where, it's actually super redundant. I think that 171 should always follow the revision cycle for 853. I think this is going to put a lot of pressure on the CAP and a lot of pressure on training, and it's going to make assessments more confusing.
All right. What would you consider a component?
That is definitely a rabbit hole that we're going to have to go down on a different episode.
The reason I'm saying that is because I agree that it probably should be media sanitation and destruction, and it should make sure that we cover all bases of anything that should exist there. But when you look at the control in 171 and you look at the discussion attached to it, it says media sanitation applies to digital and non-digital media that are subject to disposal or reuse. Okay, whether or not it's considered removable, and examples include digital media and scanners, copiers, printers, notebook computers, mobile devices, workstations, network components, and non-digital media. The sanitation process removes CUI, et cetera, et cetera. But the information cannot be retrieved or reconstructed. So you have to have something to make sure that the information cannot be retained, restored. It can't come back to life, right? And those techniques that are recommended in this discussion are erasing, clearing, purging, or destroying. So
Right.
anything
Like I
that the
said,
CUI touches, if you're going to reuse it or not use it again, it has to go through one of these methods according to the instruction. So I think I agree with you. I don't want to say I disagree with you. What I think is that instead of it missing the ball completely, I think it's a chance that maybe we could have gone a little bit more deeper. But then if you look at the supporting publication, which is 800-88, these things are listed.
yeah, I think this is going to have to be its own episode. It's definitely something that we're going to have to ask Ron about, because
we have like
the
5
reason-
episodes that have spawned off of this. This is great. I love it.
Yeah, the reason why, right? The reason why so many public comments said these are the same, these are the same, these are the same, these are redundant, get rid of them, merge them, do whatever, is because of this insistence on NIST that they must just abstract the requirements in 853 with single sentences. So when you read things like the derivative of MP6 and things like the derivative of SR12, and they just have open-ended nebulous language, of course they sound the same. When you look at 853A for MP6 and SR12, they are not the same thing. They are closely related. Maybe they should be combined, but by doing MP6, you do not do SR12. And by doing SR12, you do not do MP6. And when both of those things are determined to be relevant to CUI, but the standard says I only have to do one of them, what do I do as an assessor? How do I train assessors to understand? What do I do as an OSC whenever I'm doing one but not the other? Is it related to CUI or not? Do I have to do it or not? I'm glad we got rid of the NFO controls and we're no longer assuming that things are happening, but we just couldn't help ourselves. We have to come up with a new tailoring category and add additional confusion for the next 2 or 3 years until we go through a different revision. Like I said, we'll talk to Ron about this specifically. We submitted specific comments on this specific example in 2 different comment periods. I had 2 different individual conversations with NIST about this specific example as a reason why ORC will cause more problems than it solves, and they left it the same. So
I just, in this example, I could see both sides of the story. I could see where if I interpreted this, it makes me think that I'm going to have to destroy things.
Problem
and all
is
components
that
that touch CUI.
problem is that we're interpreting it based off of what's written in 171 rather than interpreting what's written off of 53A. And when we compare 53A in a future episode, we got to move on to item 7. They are not the same thing. This is the problem with deriving from 53 and then the blurring the lines of the description of what's going on and combining and merging things. And all of a sudden, everything sounds the same. And all of a sudden, all this redundancy is apparent. It is not true. It's not true when we get under the hood. Anyways,
I don't disagree with that.
We'll talk about it.
I do not disagree.
Last item before we have an aneurysm. Item 7, when is SP 800-171 revision 3 going to be required? We just filmed an episode with the great and powerful Lauren Ayers on the heels of the DFARS 7012 class deviation issued by DoD in May of 2024. Bottom line up front, I don't think contractors are going to be required to implement 171 Rev 3 and have their implementations verified by CMMC for around 2 to 3 years. Call it second half of 2026, maybe the first half of 2027. And here's why. The DFAR 7012 class deviation says that contractors need to implement 171 Rev 2 indefinitely, right? Now, they are going to start a CMMC rulemaking revision once the CMMC final rule is out. Once the 32 CFR CMMC final rule that establishes the CMMC program that points to 171 Rev 2 is final and effective, they're going to start rulemaking again to then update the CMMC program to point to 171 Rev 3. What did I say?
I'm just thinking in my head, like the rulemaking process took so long that they have to revise the rule to bring it back into relevancy again.
Yeah, of course, because the CMMC proposed rule says we're going to assess Rev 2. And so DFAR 7012 says you have to implement only Rev 2. But now we have Rev 3. So
But it's like running a marathon and everybody's at the finish line. Like, congratulations, you just finished running the marathon. Okay. And then there's a start line like 15 feet after you get your like banana to recharge. Like,
the rulemaking treadmill will never end because of the way that this cycle is working. Because they have to specify revisions, they have to say, well, every time a new revision comes out, we got to go through rulemaking. And then another revision comes out, we got to do more rulemaking. And then so on and so forth until the heat death of the universe and the sun expands and then incinerates the earth. We will be doing rulemaking to catch up with NIST revisions to the standards assessed by CMMC. So assuming that the CMMC final rule is final by the end of this year, which we think is a very strong likelihood, that means they would probably start the next CMMC rulemaking cycle to update to Rev 3. Let's call it first quarter of 2025. Say it takes 6 to 12 months, and then a public comment period, which is another 6 to 12 months. And we're easily looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 years. Now, different administration, different appetite, different rule. You could end up with an interim final rule that goes a little bit faster. A revision and updating to a new standard is a lot faster and more efficient than establishing a program from scratch. So there's a chance that it could go faster than usual, but we're not talking 6 months here. We're talking 18, 24 months realistically, based off of what's happening. So people have plenty of time to ingest what's going on with 171 Rev 3, plan for what's going on with 171 Rev 3. The nice part is we know exactly what the future holds, because when CMMC is updated, it will point to this standard. It isn't CMMC is going to be updated to point to some standard that we don't know yet. This is what will be required in the future. 171 is what is required exactly right now and for the foreseeable future. So we know exactly what the requirements are. We know exactly what the requirements will be. We know all the weird tweaks and design decisions and quirks and confusing points. Plenty of time to sort those out, I hope, in terms of ORC and this and that and blah, blah, blah. All these rabbit holes. We're going to have tons of episodes on all of them for posterity's sake. So in 2-ish years, when 171 Rev 3 probably catches everybody off guard and completely flat-footed, we can just reference back to episodes we talked about now, which will be 2 years. Hello, everyone in the future. Finding this episode for the first time in a waking up in a cold sweat and a panic, being told you have to implement 171 Revision 3. Here's all the information you need to know about. Find it in the links below.
Do you have a new DFARS clause that says that you must implement 800-171 Revision 3 no later than December 31st, 2027?
Well, you come to the right place.
That funny professor with the funny hair and the cool car wasn't lying to you. You're going to learn something new today.
Yeah, this is like that scene in WALL-E whenever they find the plant and then all of a sudden they play the video. Congratulations, you found the plant. We should make an intro like that in the future. We'll talk to producer Dustin about it. Anyways, those are the 7 high-level things that I think people need to know about 171 Revision 3 without going into too many rabbit holes. The revision has increased, but the formatting will hide that increase from you. 171A has increased significantly, so definitely pay attention to that, as you always should. ODPs are 100% here to stay. There are new control families, but not really. There are no more NFO controls, thank God. ORC controls are here to stay, which I hate. And we think that it'll probably be required sometime in the next 2 to 3 years. That's what you need to know off the top.
Sure. I think that this allows DIB organizations now to, like we said, not be caught off guard, but to lay a great foundation, because there is planning that needs to take place, right? There may be need to be changes. There may need to be funding diverted into consultation, funding diverted into technical, But you get what I'm saying? That this may be a proper time to actually plan out
internally. I think you meant government.
Yeah. No. I mean, like internal funding, right? Like the biggest thing, budgetary constraints. You're supposed to take 10%. Well, now we know that 10% of our budget has to be dedicated towards our uplift to Revision 3. I think that it puts organizations that are actually paying attention to this and that are really serious about the requirements that are imposed upon them. I think it puts them in a great position not to be caught off guard like some organizations were with the implementation of the CMMC, 1.0, 2.0, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty, everybody. That's what you need to know for the initial introduction to the new standard, and we'll start going down some rabbit holes moving forward. See you next week.
See you next week.